So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and for something a little bit more manageable in terms of battle size than the ones that we've been looking at more recently, albeit it's still within a cityscape, but it happens on slightly more even footing, as this is the 2v2, so it's going to be a little bit more of a case of who can manoeuvre through this particular set of terrain and obstacles the best. And there is also a couple of interesting restrictions on this one, the main one being that there is a no cavalry rule, which in particular for one of the teams here on the blue side of things is going to be an interesting little restriction given the nature of the faction at hand. This is a map that we have seen a couple of times in the past in a similar sort of vein to this as well. It seems to be a fairly decent cityscape map for fighting on even footing, because there is obviously terrain advantages to be had, but both sides are able to take advantage of these for the most part, rather than one side having the lion's share, albeit the blue team are starting off in maybe a slightly more advantageous initial position, so we shall see how that goes. But I guess we'll go with the blue team first and foremost. It is going to be a good versus evil battle as well, and interestingly enough as well, Dorwinion and Rohan, who I suppose it's not beyond the pale that they would have interactions. I mean, it's mostly flat terrain between the two, albeit the mighty Anduin does separate the two of them, but they're not so far away from one another that this sort of alliance wouldn't be struck up. Caden of Dorwinion is going to be playing as Dorwinion, one of the factions as well that we have not yet seen in the faction overview series, but they're well documented in terms of what they are. The split between the more rugged, lower end perhaps, but dependable and heavily armoured humans, and then the slightly more high end, damaging but more vulnerable elves. The interplay between the two types of units going to be important, and will certainly be so in this sort of situation where infantry is going to be the be all and end all. The Elvalin Vinegard, a good enough force for the front line as well. In terms of individual quality, they perhaps have a little bit more than your average spear, but that is also true of their Rohirrim allies today. But the Vinegard here are still going to be a little bit more dependent upon their armour, but spears are always going to be pretty good at clogging up this sort of situation as well when they're fighting in narrow spaces. Of course, the anti-cavalry bonus not going to be important at all in this particular matchup, but still, they have their defensive advantages. Morroquendi pikes are going to be an important inclusion because, especially in an infantry-only fight, of course, Rohan don't have access to any phalanx units, so Dorwinion are going to have to take on the entirety of the responsibility for that. Fortunately, the Morroquendi pikes are a good option there. They can be vulnerable to missiles, but then there are very few pikes in the game that aren't, and elven pikes like this also have a tendency of being more damaging than your average unit of long weapon units as well, so that should be fairly useful against whomever they are facing off against today. Morroquendi bows as well. I mean, higher end elven archers are always going to have that damage, and the Morroquendi bows also twin that with some poison projectiles, which, especially when you get fighting in a choke point, can really send lower tier armies routing just that little bit more quickly, give you that little bit more of an edge in that sort of situation. You know, they are a little bit lower in terms of numbers, and the Morroquendi themselves, their armour is passable, but they can certainly be outskirmished by heavier archers if the situation arises, so positioning is going to be important for them, as well as their choice of target. Second unit of Elvalin Vinegard just in behind, as well as another unit of Morroquendi bows. Up here on this raised terrain in a nice dug-in position, we have the ballista in typical elven fashion as well. They all have pretty much the same artillery crew, just with a colour palette swap, and the standard ballista, which is perhaps the least exciting but one of the more dependable units of artillery that the game has to offer in this sort of situation as well. It can scarcely miss any units that come down that route, but whether the red team will decide to or not based on the opposition they would face remains to be seen. A couple of units of river patrol, again another example of Dorwinion having access to a cheaper but certainly dependable unit of human infantry, javelin infantry on this occasion as well. Reasonably cheap. The shield value on them is not terrible either, but the gambesons alone and relatively low melee stats means that if they do get caught out, they're not going to last on their own, but if they are out on their own, then that is user error more than anything else. Again, good javelins for the tier and for the cost, and in this sort of situation where you're a little bit more constricted, especially given the infantry only rules, that's going to be a nice useful thing to have in the back pocket as well. And over here we've got another unit of Morroquendi bows, 3 units of them is a big investment, and then down here a unit which I think was simply forgotten to be moved are the human equivalent, the Elvalin marksman, and where I mentioned that the Morroquendi bows maybe wouldn't be quite so good at trading fire with the opposition, that's exactly what the Elvalin marksmen are for, with their focus on armour, again, slightly lower cost, slightly lower damage, but again, heavily armoured, good at trading back and forth with the enemy, and ultimately are still going to be more than capable of chucking out decent amounts of damage if they are unresponded to by the red team today. And moving across to their allies today, to the player who sent me this battle replay, which is Master Blaster, so thank you to him. Rohan, which in terms of an infantry-only force, interesting choice given the restrictions on the battle, but I guess everyone likes a challenge. Westmark Spearmen, similar sort of story as with the Elvalin Spearmen that we've already seen, in the sense that they're a little bit less numerous than your average unit of human spears, but they do make up for that in terms of their stats, and perhaps in terms of the terrain they're occupying, it's narrow enough that you want that quality a little bit more perhaps than the numbers. They don't have quite the same armour focus as Dorwinion's human units either, and they are a little bit less numerous again, so there is less margin for error with them. But we have seen them recently defend Helm's Deep, and they were very good on home turf, so we'll see what they do when they fight alongside Dorwinion here. More of the Westmark Spearmen. In and amongst them, there are the Helmingas as well. A good melee combatant as far as archers go, at least for the most part. I mean, nothing groundbreaking, but they can at least defend themselves, and they are about as good at range at dealing damage as the Elvalin marksman, but maybe a little bit worse at taking damage because of the armour discrepancy, but probably a little bit better in melee, so there's a few trade-offs to be had there, but more of a dependable workhorse kind of unit than one that's going to win you the battle perhaps. In and amongst this force we can also see that there are some Westmark Marshals, obviously heavy axemen. We saw them used to great effect the last time the Rohan infantry was in action, and they're going to be pretty key on this occasion as well, because it's really the area where Rohan's infantry is at its strongest. Westmark Marshals being the higher end offering. More Westmark Spearmen. Eastmark Archers are in there as well, probably because money was getting a little bit tight, so just bringing the cheapest archers that Rohan have at their disposal. More units of them. The Westmark Infantry, of course, the sword and shield variant, and they perform very well also. Again, less numerous, but decently skilled, decently damaging, slightly lower armour as well in comparison to their western counterparts, but we shall see. Although in Dorwinion's case it is eastern. They are the furthest east of their kind in Middle-earth. Eastmark Spearmen, also here, cheap javelins, much like the River Patrol that we've already seen, maybe a little bit better at keeping themselves alive in melee, just because spears tend to have that ability to dig themselves in a little bit more, but certainly not the last word in terms of quality. So again, cheap javelins so far the name of the game, but Rohan, as we know, do have access to some particularly nasty skirmishes, including the Shield Maidens, still very central to Rohan's forces. You can see a few of them in there. The Helm Hammers, who are very good in the defence of Helm's Deep. Great Shield Infantry, I think the only bodyguard tier Great Shield Infantry that the game has to offer, so they've got that heightened mass and big damage off of those Warhammers as well. Westmark Marshals are in there, obviously the Medicel Guard, the other unit of throwing projectiles that Rohan have, and also very accomplished in melee as well, maybe less show-stopping than the Helm Hammers, but still very, very dependable in that regard at the high end. And the Dwarven Catapult is also here, complete with the dwarves that man it, so more damaging than the Elven Ballista for sure, maybe a little bit less predictable as Medieval 2 artillery tends to be, but we'll see how well they can deploy that damage here. There may be a couple of other units that we've missed as well in this mass of units that Rohan have over here. Now then, the red team, and it's basically the rivals of the two factions that we've already seen, so definitely a theme going on, because Isengard are going to be lining up on the forces of evil, Nazgul playing as them, ironically enough. Uruk-hai archers, so again, they're not going to be able to really defeat certainly Dorwinion skirmishers at long range. Rohan, only a token effort there, but Dorwinion, you expect them to take on the lion's share of the work at longer range, and the Elvalin and the Morroquendi will be too much for the standard Uruk-hai archers to deal with, but still, even a basic presence means they've got some sort of answer to go back and forth with their opposition before they then move forward with the real match winners, which will be their infantry. Guards of Orthanc, a very sturdy unit who should do very well actually under the duress of all of the archer-based skirmishers that the defenders have, less so perhaps against the javelins and certainly the artillery. Reasonably expensive for a unit which is not really damage focused. They are very much a defensive unit by nature, but they should keep Isengard marching in the correct direction. I think indeed, yeah, 2 units of the Uruk-hai Berserkers as well. I mean, a very dangerous unit, this, of course, with 3 hit points, massive amounts of damage, the armor piercing as well. Certainly will be useful against the men of Dorwinion, and to a slightly lesser extent as well, the men of Rohan. They may find themselves coming unstuck a little bit against some of the Dorwinion elves, especially if they get caught in the end of those pikes, but there wasn't a huge amount of bodyguard quality that we saw from Dorwinion, which is interesting. So, yeah, very scary if they close the gap, but also vulnerable to any type of projectile that hits them, especially once their hit points have been reduced. As far as an artillery piece goes, though, a very intimidating one, the Isengard Ballista. Very, very reliable as well in terms of the kind of damage it can deal, but it's going to have to wheel its way into position, whereas the defending artillery is already there. They're pretty big targets as well, so while artillery may now take several shots to actually finish off, it's going to be up to Isengard to make sure they finesse their artillery into the right kind of position so it can deploy that damage we know it's capable of. Again, Isengard not lacking for armor piercing, although perhaps the base damage will also be important across the roster as a whole as well. Uruk-hai Reavers, though, again vulnerable to skirmishers, but not as scary as the Berserkers, but you have to cut your corners somewhere in terms of what you decide to bring to the field. The Uruk-hai Infantry, meanwhile, very dependable force when it comes to marching forward. Few similarities with the opposing Westmarks in the sense that they're a little bit lower numbers than their equivalent Orcish units, perhaps from other Orc factions, but a little bit higher in terms of their melee prowess as well, both in terms of damage and defense in terms of the Uruk-hai Infantry, because they don't skimp on armor as well, like Rohan do a little bit more at the high end. Plenty of them as well, and if they have to march into hostile terrain, which the red team probably will have to do, given the blue team have already set up shop over there, it's going to be an interesting situation for them to be in. Nazkai as well, the closest that Nazgul will get to being able to field his namesake. Very, very scary as well. Again, one of the best examples of this kind of unit that the game has to offer. Big damage, big armor, all of the weaknesses of the Berserkers pretty much eliminated with that armor, to be fair. At least in terms of general use. There are, of course, in terms of bodyguard to bodyguard conflict, there is going to be certain shortcomings that each class of unit offers. Trolls of the White Hand are going to be an interesting unit for the defenders to try and stop once they get moved forward. Rohan probably have more natural tools for dealing with them than Dorwinion do, with all of the heavy axemen and throwing projectiles they have, but we know how devastating trolls can be in this new version of the game. And a full line of Uruk-hai pikemen. Not too surprising this. I mean, 1-to-1 the Morroquendi will out-damage them, but Isengard can bring more of them before the red limit kicks into play. The armour is also better, so in terms of stray projectiles they stand a better chance of tanking them. But yeah, in terms of overall numbers, they are going to be here in higher quantities. And then, as for Dorwinion's rival, it is of course the men mostly in gold, which is going to be Rhun, played by Lobot. I think the last time we saw him he was playing as Rhun as well, so he clearly has his preferences. The only faction as well to seemingly have brought crossbows. Isengard seem to have foregone them in favour of bringing the slightly cheaper Uruk-hai archers, which is a rarity, but with Rhun bringing them, maybe not quite as intimidating as the Uruk-hai, and easier to deal with as well with their lighter armour, but the damage will come all the same if the blue team are not willing to deal with them quickly. Crossbows, we know, in this sort of battle can be particularly problematic for those that are facing off against them. And then of course you have the Dragon's Wrath crossbows over here with their heavy bolts. It's going to be an interesting situation to try and deal with them, because they're able to withstand opposing range punishment far better than most crossbows are, and they're also not half bad in melee either, so it's just a case of positioning though. You don't want to be arcing their shots, and obviously the raised plateaus which these players were going to be operating on will offer the blue team some shelter from them. More phalanx units as well, the halberdiers of Rhun, the Loke-Gamp Rim. Obviously it's a lot of work that the Dorwinion polearms are going to have to be doing to try and keep them at arm's length in melee, but lots of projectiles and lots of throwing projectiles in particular on the field from the blue team may give the Uruk-hai pikes and these guys a little bit more pause. Obviously the armour piercing nature of them maybe won't be quite so important given the factions that are on display, but the fact they're a phalanx unit at all I think is going to be definitely a useful thing. The Scion Rim, very durable of course, although that will be very useful I think against Dorwinion, but they will need to be careful of all that Rohan armour piercing, because that is where they could come unstuck a little bit. But they should do reasonably well at weathering the long-range storm and also being that defensive unit at the core of Rhun's efforts there. Carmel's chosen the bodyguard tier unit. Maybe not quite as flashy as something like the Nazkai or Helm Hammers, but definitely very dependable, and that could be key come the late game. I think it's going to be a case of who can outlast who here. I think if it comes down to a slugfest, I'd back the red team, but if that burst damage from the blue team can do its thing, you worry. So the Carmel's Chosen, if all goes well for the red team, should be a real standout unit. More armor piercing from the Flag Rim as well, so the Elvelin for Dorwinion are going to be up against it here with all the armor piercing that is on display against them, but we'll see. Second unit of Carmel's Chosen as well. So I mean, the red team I think have got a little bit more budget to work with, which makes sense given the blue team's defensive position. So yeah, the onus is definitely going to be on the red team to move forward. So this is going to be maybe a little bit more of a traditional siege than I was initially thinking. Another unit of Flag Rim, of course. We have the Dragon's Breath as well, which many times we've seen it in the lead up to release. It was very, very effective. It is obviously a big target for opposing artillery to hit. So again, much like the Isengard Ballista, it can be a little bit easier to snipe out with the new rebalancing. It also does need a clear shot, kind of similar to a Ballista, but both Rhun and Isengard have got access to artillery that can devastate the opposition if it does get into a good position, so we'll see if the Medieval 2 Pathfinding decides to play ball. Pretty decent crew in melee as well. And finally we have the Balkoth Sapphire Bladesman, another high-end Javelin unit that's also pretty good in melee, more damage focused than defense focused like the Metacell Guard though. Metacell Guard are also bodyguard tier, whereas the Sapphire Bladesmen now are just that one step lower, merely a high tier unit, but still plenty of damage, and also this is actually where the general's going to be, so it may not be intended as a bodyguard unit anymore, but that is the role that it is going to be filling in today's battle. So I think, I don't know, I'm in two minds here about whether to start immediately. I think I will make a little bit of a cut, because I do think the manoeuvring phase is going to be relatively short. I think Rhun are just probably going to hot-foot it over here and start putting some pressure on the side here, and maybe a little bit of re-manoeuvring from the blue team to really start digging in. But I can't imagine this is going to be a battle that we're going to see too much of a lull in. I think it's going to be a fairly fast and frenetic affair once things get going and everyone is set up. So we'll see how it we'll see how it goes once the battle gets started, shall we? So I suppose we shall rejoin here as the Dorwinion archers are already taking aim and shooting at the Uruk-hai as they stray just a little bit too close, and I guess there's no real need for a grace period on the defenders' part, seeing as they were already in position, so no need to allow the attackers to stack up freely, and indeed going after the Uruk-hai pikemen is most certainly the best move that they could make here, because this is going to be one of the more troublesome opponents as the battle goes on, if they are still alive come the end. And also we've got any other kills are going to be inflicted upon the Uruk-hai infantry as well, so seeing the benefits of that elven damage as the Uruk-hai armour is good, but not quite good enough perhaps to deal the full litany of damage. And also now the Dwarven catapult also taking aim at this small detachment wing really of the Isengard force, albeit it is a fairly significant one because the trolls are here. It is interesting that the trolls are maybe not with the bigger part of the Isengard army, although this one unit of Morroquendi bows is going to have its position over here be somewhat short-lived, you would imagine, purely because they're going to have to retreat in the face of the on-rushing Isengard forces. They're going to have to do so pretty quickly as well. May have gotten a little bit too greedy there with one volley too many, as Isengard have managed to hot-foot it up onto the high ground fairly quickly, and they are going to get in the way of the Morroquendi bows. I think they're just going to be able to slip by, and again the beauty of elven archers is the fact that they can look after themselves just fine in melee. I mean, 1-to-1 you wouldn't want to keep them in melee against an accomplished unit of infantry like the Uruk-hai here, but they can still put up a decent fight. I don't think Master Blaster would have wanted the Eastmark Spearmen to be the first unit that he committed to this particular engagement either, purely because you'd want to use their javelins before anything else. But if you were to throw something in the way, you'd want to save the Morroquendi bows, I think, for later on. There's also the small matter of the shield maidens throwing their payloads in as well, albeit the shields of the Uruk-hai infantry will blunt those throwing axes somewhat, but throwing axes base damage is so high that you're still going to take casualties nonetheless. And this is a little bit more like it from Rohan as well, trying to peel their javelins off the front line. They will take losses, but at least the ammunition supply will be safe. And the Westmark Spearmen are a far better one-to-one opponent against the Uruk-hai. Classic matchup that, and now the Westmark Marshals coming into place as well. A little bit surprised they didn't get themselves into a slightly better situation earlier, to be honest, but Uruk-hai archers already up onto the same level of elevation as well. That is one thing with this map. It is very, very difficult for you as the defenders to be able to cover all of your bases and keep the attackers off of either this plateau or the other one if that's where you decide to try and set up shop. So you have to rely on choke points more than elevation. Uruk-hai archers already being put in their place somewhat by the defending skirmishers. Carmel's shadow bows moving forward, and you can see here that the attackers are trying to skirmish a little bit with the defenders, but you can also see the situation that they're dealing with. I mean, Carmel's shadow bows being rangers have got very good damage, but they're not going to be very good in a skirmish fight like this, especially not when they're dealing with units of archers like the Morroquendi, who are going to have the damage to rip them apart very, very quickly. Rhun picking their way through the settlement piece by piece as well, but again leading the way with their pole arms, and that is going to give the green light for all of the defending skirmishers to do their thing. But again, Dorwinion don't have the most quality when it comes to their infantry, so if they can weather this storm somewhat, the attackers, they should find themselves in a fairly decent position moving forward. Shield Maidens putting themselves in the defensive position within this square building. Rohan, the combination of the defensive spears and the aggressive axemen, Uruk-hai archers in position to support and going after some of the skirmishing units. I mean, the Dwarven catapult crew will be pretty resilient against that sort of thing, but Medieval 2 artillery pathfinding seems to have stricken it to spinning on the spot, as is tradition. Still just Uruk-hai infantry for the time being, and again, that armour piercing is probably going to be what's going to tip the scales in this particular fight. The spearmen being that defensive bastion, and then those axemen laying on the hurt. Although the Uruk-hai pikemen would change matters, Rohan will need to utilise their throwing projectiles to do some more damage and finish what the Morroquendi bows started earlier on. Guards of Orthanc filtering off to the side. Uruk-hai archers continuing to do their thing, acting in support. Here you can see that, to be fair, some of the Morroquendi bows have fallen in the exchange with the Uruk-hai archers, but certainly the defenders have had the better of that engagement, and that's with relatively even terrain for the most part. Rhun, on the other hand, have not been so fortunate, although they are now starting to stack up over here. What's going on here? One unit. Nandor Glade Guard that are hidden, waiting for their moment. So, shock infantry rather than any sort of cavalry, which Dorwinion do have cavalry that can hide. Valin Vinegard forming up the initial line. The Scion Rim, certainly the superior of the two units of spears. We'll just go down to half speed actually while things develop here. Archers firing overhead, so Rhun and Isengard going to be marching through here. Rhun's army is still somewhat stretched. A lot of their forces still at the foot of these cliffs, and these Morroquendi bows so far across the board. You can see why Caden has decided to bring so many of them, although that's a lot of wasted ammunition by shooting arrows into the dirt. That is one thing which is fairly common on cityscapes because of the natural elements to many of their constructions. Morroquendi bows doing their thing, and the Uruk-hai infantry actually shaken, which is an impressive thing. Poison projectiles doing their thing there. Lots of damage there to the Eastmark spearmen, done by artillery? I'd imagine that's probably friendly fire from the Dwarven catapult, to be honest. Ballista, which is also going to pile the pressure mentally on these units as they move forward. Right into the heart of the Uruk-hai Reavers again, ripping down through the ranks. Doesn't really matter what kind of unit it is, quantity of kills is the main thing with artillery. So going right down the gut of those units is definitely the right call. Valin Vinegard holding the line for now. And it is the support of the ranged units in the artillery which will shore them up for the time being, because 1-to-1 against Scion Rim or Uruk-hai infantry, you wouldn't really back them. They would last for quite a while, they wouldn't win the fight. In melee terms, it is going to be the Morroquendi pikes that gives a bit of a leg up here to the defenders. Still some looped shots as well. Still raining down from the Morroquendi bows, and well, the Dragon's Breath is in a good position, and that may have a bearing on the fight to come. Again, the natural barriers are a little bit of an issue. Dragon's Breath does need a somewhat straight shot. Doesn't have the benefit of as great an arc as any of the catapult or trebuchet variants. We'll just see what it's going to be capable of here. I think they're going directly after the Morroquendi bows. The bouncing projectile means that it can hit units in behind, and while it has missed, it will go right into the unit of Eastmark Spearmen here. Maybe not the highest quality of target, but these missiles are still finding their mark, and that was a very nice hit. So Dorwinion and Rohan are going to have to scatter to the winds a little bit here, because they can't afford to take shots of that nature. The back and forth between both sides' artillery here is going to be one of the deciding factors, you would think, and the defenders should have the edge there because they've been able to entrench themselves, whereas the attackers are going to have to get a bit creative. But good use of the cannon, that, from Rohan, or Rhun I should say. They've managed to find an angle which works for them as the frontline fights continue. Presence of the Morroquendi pikes, even with the arriving Gamp Brim, isn't going to be too much of a problem. It would be the Uruk-hai that would need to try and even the odds over there. Rohan, meanwhile, are pushing back the support of the artillery, and well, the artillery is waving off now, but throwing projectiles remaining. Rohan's infantry is in the ascendancy, albeit they are probably going to need some reinforcements over here because their numbers are not limitless, as is often the way with heavy axemen, but just in terms of numbers here, Isengard have got their reinforcements closer by, and the Uruk-hai pikemen will join the fray. The javelins managing to get a decent series of volleys on them as they do move forwards. How much in the way of reinforcements? I mean, the trolls follow through with the guards of Orthanc. That's the only thing they have left over here, really, but the trolls could make a gap for these units to move forward under the cover of the Uruk-hai archers as well. Shield Maidens moving forwards again, Elvelyn marksmen. I mean, a lot of these units are skirmishers, so the trolls being committed at this moment could be exactly the right move by Isengard. And timing, I mean, especially in a 2v2 siege like this, timing of when you use your units is going to be far more significant than it would be if there were more players. There's more margin for error in that sort of situation, but not quite so much here. And that is going to be a concern. Whip of those projectiles of Rohan and Dorwinion. Morroquendi bows still firing into the sides of these units as they arrive, just as the Uruk-hai Reavers join the front line. Arrows still floating overhead. Heaven's Breath not shooting at the moment, neither is the ballista, so both sides, even though the battle is well and truly joined on, we'll call this the primary front line, purely because everyone has got a stake in it, whereas that one over there is more of a flanking force. People, artillery firing away, hitting into the building there in the distance. Isengard ballista, more trolls of the White Hand over there as well. Very significant unit, of course. Eastmark Spearmen, I mean, trolls are big targets, but they can tank, especially basic javelins like this. So while damage will be being done, can't really afford too much in the way of friendly fire, but they are at least hitting enemy units as well. Occasional throwing axe from the Shield Maidens as well. I mean, the trolls are definitely going to break through here if there are no infantry reinforcements forthcoming. This will go back up to 1 speed. High archers as well are going to be largely unimpeded because the defenders are going to want to prioritise other targets. I mean, the lower the man count of Rohan gets on that front line, the more guilt-free they can be about utilising their Dwarven Catapult. The high armour and shielded nature of them as well has helped them as they've garnered the attention of the Uruk-hai archers. Meanwhile, Morroquendi bows that are out of ammunition joining the front line, and their skill will be helpful, especially against the slightly clumsier Reavers, but trolls moving forward again, and they will be just the thing for dealing with the Uruk-hai pikes, who've ripping through their own units and some of the enemies, to be fair. Throwing axes raining down from on high. They were targeting the trolls, which is something that can be done. I mean, it is a way that you can kill them instantly, but there's no guarantee that you're going to hit even with a ballista, the most accurate of all artillery pieces. And with the arrival of the trolls, perhaps some of the heavy hitters and the helms hammers will be needed on the front line. I would agree with that move as well. I mean, the Dwarven Catapult has been, to be frank, a complete disaster so far. It's gotten far, far more friendly fire than it has managed to hit enemy forces. They're going to need for it to start turning its fortunes around quickly, because if it does that again, this front line is in real danger of collapsing. I mean, it's also doing absolutely devastating damage to the attackers, but the attackers always tend to be able to put up with more of that sort of punishment than otherwise, although the Siren are routing. There's a lot of Uruk-hai Reavers fleeing the front line as well, whereas the defenders have stood their ground, so in the long run maybe that will work out. There's also the additional support of the Elvellyn marksmen. I mean, again, defenders, skirmishers able to get into a better position than the attackers, who are trying to support their front line. They are going to need more reinforcements to move forward as well. I mean, yeah, firing into the backfield for the Dwarven Catapult is maybe not quite as lucrative, but it's definitely a little bit more risk-free. And the Isengard Ballista now as well. An artillery duel of sorts, and one that the defenders are winning, so a very topsy-turvy series of events this, but I think the defenders have come out of that the better for it. Two of the Isengard Ballistas have managed to be set alight before they've really been able to do much damage. And the Dwarven Catapult also trying to do its thing, but as long as one of those remains standing, it's still a bit of a concern, albeit if it fires in here, they may meet the same fate that Dwarven Catapult just did, in that they're likely to do damage to their own men as well. It's very fast and frenetic now, this battle. Baneguard joining the front line, the rigid Carmel's chosen as well. Westmark infantry joining in, so initially what was a purely Dorwinion defence has been joined by some Rohirrim. And to say as well, the Helmshammers, who have burrowed their way into the enemy formations, have also done a real number on the Trolls. One of the more impressive performances against Trolls I've seen. It's two battles in a row where having a bodyguard Great Shield infantry unit really does give you a very potent tool. The problem with the other Great Shield units among the Orcs is that they tend to fall away because they don't have the melee expertise to back up their grunts, but that's not true with the Helmhammers. Nandor Glade Guard revealing themselves, getting in there alongside the Eastmark Spears, but the Glade Guard will be the ones to do the damage against the Trolls over here, albeit not quite to the same pace. Meanwhile, I'm a little bit surprised this didn't happen a little bit sooner. Some Eastmark Spearmen revealing themselves, but that one unit of Glade Guard that was lying in ambush have revealed themselves, albeit the Dragon's Breath artillery crew is a very strong one. So this is going to be a distraction more than anything else, because they should be able to defeat the Glade Guard 1-to-1. Which will be a concern for them, but if they can win the battle elsewhere, they could make the Dragon's Breath crew irrelevant. Helmingas supporting their unit of basic spears down here, but the Shadow Bows, the damage was done to them by the Morroquendi earlier on, so even this basic unit of Rohirrim spears can pick them off, and they can start securing parts of the low ground as well and start isolating elements of the more of the Westmark infantry coming down from on high as well. That unit of Helmingas joining melee, but against the Shadow Guard they're made of sterner stuff than the Rangers are in melee, certainly. Meanwhile, Dwarven Catapult still doing its thing, Baneguard routing off now as well. Some of the Dorwinion units have now started to flee in all fairness, but routing has been far more commonplace among the attackers for the time being. I mean, you can definitely see why, given direct hits from the artillery, flaming arrows now coming in. It's not been a pleasant engagement for either side, but to be fair, the Helmhammers have now fallen away and the Trolls are still there. Every chance these guys could still burrow their way through, and let's not forget, it's not exactly a limitless force of infantry that the defenders have access to, and the single strongest unit of infantry they have has already been committed and been expended. Some out of ammo skirmishers, however, the only reinforcements forthcoming. Both sides, in fact, albeit the shield maidens are made of slightly sterner stuff, and they will inspire nearby units as well to continue the fight. Another troll falls. Carmel's chosen, however, going to have to deal with the Westmark Marshals. Interesting matchups all round this. Meanwhile, the Trolls over here again bloodied, but healthier and in better shape. Catapult out of ammunition, and now the Dwarves being committed to melee to try and stop the advance of Isengard over here. The problem Isengard have, though, is that they do have some Reavers that they've repositioned over here, redeployed. But even if they do break through, do they really have the hammer blow of units over here? I guess it depends on how many pikes and guards of Orthanc survive, but there's no guarantee the trolls will even be able to get through here. I think these marksmen, a little bit more of a delaying tactic than anything else, as the trolls try to waddle through any gaps they can try and create. Still a little bit more ammunition yet to be expended by Dorwinion, and not as damaging as the Morroquendi, but any support they can offer to the front lines will be key as the battle goes along. Shield Maiden's in a very nice position as well to utilise their throwing axes. Direct hits are always better than the looped shots we saw earlier on, and the javelins doing the same. The Rohirrim throwing projectiles have been, again, a cornerstone of this defence, much like the Battle of Helm's Deep we saw a few weeks back. Could they once again be the determining factor? Good hits once more. Need some more reinforcements here on the front line, the attackers, but I don't think they're going to have enough. They've still got stuff like Balkos Sapphire Bladesmen, but they're caught out here in the, well, no man's land really, trying to deal with the ambush parties that the defenders set, which should ultimately be dealt with. The Glade Guard actually did pretty damn well against the Dragon's Breath crew, numbers maybe on their side, but the Sapphire Bladesmen being here means they should finally deal with this unit, but are they going to have an army to support when all is said and done? And Rohan sending over some reinforcements as well. Westmark infantry, not the easiest unit to get rid of. So here out in broken play, the defenders also making some good moves. Carmel Shadowbow's trying to offer a little bit of support, which isn't insignificant, but as long as the battle in the main part of the field goes their way, I think they'll be pretty happy. I mean, a significant unit as well. A bit of a clash of the Titans between the Uruk-hai Berserkers and the Medicel Guard. Both units which maybe would be more useful on high ground, but the Shield Maidens, do they have ammunition? Stacking up, I don't think they do. I mean, getting into melee surrounding the Uruk-hai Berserkers, I mean, defence isn't exactly their forte anyway, but this should mean that once again another potential problem for the defenders is diffused. And where the Nazkai went, possibly killed earlier on in an artillery barrage or something similar, but this is going to be an outright victory for the defenders here on this main front. A costly one, admittedly, but one that they would absolutely take in the given circumstances. Rohan still very much doing their thing. That crossbowman getting bisected by one of the Westmark marshals, Helmingas. Looks like they still have ammunition because their bows are still drawn, so a little bit of range support still from some of the more basic skirmishers on the field. And more Westmark spearmen to really cement this victory in the main attacking lane, which is only going to increase the importance of this engagement over here, which Isengard aren't doing too badly in. At least holding their own, but they're not exactly storming to a victory over here. And to be fair, they have redeployed more units as well, these from crossbows. The problem is they're going to need to win over here fairly sharpish. Otherwise, the defenders will be able to reposition as well. There goes the Rohan General, to be fair. The Uruk-hai Berserkers showcasing how dangerous a unit they can be, even when they're in a bit of a sticky situation. Carmel Shadowbows, I mean, they're standing and shooting the Medicel Guard, which is bold considering they've still got some Berserkers hacking away at their backs. Shadowbows trying to defuse them. Helmingas utilising their ammunition to try and kill off what remains of the Berserkers, but I mean, the Rohan General's loss is not insignificant either. I mean, human-based factions are by no means, for the most part, bastions of morale, and Rohan can be mentally broken. It's been more of a hallmark of the attackers in this battle so far than the defenders, but that could change. Sapphire Bladesmen, meanwhile, toe-to-toe with the Westmark infantry. Back the Sapphire Bladesmen 1-to-1, but the numbers discrepancy that exists means it's May very well end up being another Pyrrhic victory for the defenders. These are stacking up, but we have seen this kind of battle before, and the defenders can come storming back in the late game if they have a section of their army which is suitably strong, which would have to be over here, you would suggest. Still the Nazkai are alive. They have taken a... Oh, it doesn't look like they've taken much damage. Another unit of Berserkers, the very dangerous Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen, who are firing away at the pursuing defenders over on the other side of these cliffs. Westmark Marshals as well, so a good target, and the damage will be not insignificant by any means. Another unit of Sapphire Bladesmen, so this is a very strong part of the attacking army. Trolls are still alive because there's really been no damaging units which have been placed in their way. So they are certainly not out of this, the attackers. They could even be considered the favourites because they need to consolidate their remaining forces at this point, the defenders, and not chase meaningless fights. They've done pretty well in those satellite engagements so far, but placing too much stock in them may end up spelling their doom here if they're not careful. Westmark infantry is still fighting, and you don't want to leave these Sapphire Bladesmen alive now that they've been fighting this fight for this long. Decent back and forth. Isengard, I mean, they should still be alive in the late game, and they will need a little bit of quality to deal with what's to come. Maybe a little bit of range support as well from the Helmingas will be just the ticket against something like those Nazkai. And over here, some E-strong crossbows that have managed to find their way in behind enemy lines, trying to stop this slightly battered unit of River Patrol from offering what support they can. Firing in there. Strong crossbows, though, a significantly weak melee combatant. So are the River Patrol, to be fair, but they've got elves nipping at their heels. All of those units that were pursuing now redeployed, so the defenders will be able to staunch the bleeding for now. Guards of Orthanc, they've been involved in this fight for quite a while alongside the pikes and the trolls. A very tough selection of units to deal with quickly. Javelins and throwing axes can do it, but they haven't had the best angle for their shots here, the defenders, and that will concern them moving into the latter stages. Javelins ripping past, but the Balkal Sapphire Bladesmen returning in kind, and they are a significantly more potent force than the Eastmark Spearmen. Westmark Spearmen will join the front line and again shore things up, but these are all just delaying measures for the defenders so far. It remains to be seen really what tools they have at their disposal to be able to truly turn this battle around. They may have dumped too many of their supporting tools too quickly. I mean, if this ballista still has ammunition, that could be their saving grace. I mean, to be fair, I didn't see these guys in the deployment phase. I don't know where they were, but both bodyguard units for the Dorwinion player does change things significantly. It makes it a far more even affair, you would suggest. Especially those friendly Blade Lords, they'll be pretty damn good against most of what the attackers can throw. In fact, those two Dorwinion bodyguards makes me reconsider. Was I just blind in the deployment phase and didn't see them? Probably. That means I still, it does change my mind significantly, and it makes me think the defenders have got the edge. I mean, they have had the better of most of the engagements throughout the battle, but as we've often said, that doesn't necessarily translate for victories for the defenders, but maybe with that quality they still can, and they've still got some reinforcements left to come back. Guard, some Westmark infantry managing to clean things up over here, so it is turning into a singular battle now. The question remains, what do the attackers do now? I think they need to kind of go all in, try and cause a bit of chaos. The trolls are starting to fall away, the Sapphire Bladesmen being committed to the front line, offering their heightened levels of damage that they can provide. Guard on the front line as well. Helmingas still have a bit of ammunition of their own. Again, not a particularly damaging archer, but any sort of support they can offer for their front line at this point is going to be much appreciated. Some of the very depleted units that were a part of the main engagement over there now starting to be rallied to the front line as well. A cluster of those Westmark units, which again, in terms of numbers, they may not have the equivalent strength of their fellow Western kingdoms, but in an engagement as narrow as this, you would probably take their expertise, especially when you consider all of the armour piercing that Isengard and Rhun have at their disposal. The armour isn't necessarily the winning formula. Based on what Rohan and Dorwinion have left, they're not going to be dependent on that sort of thing, so that will take a little bit of the effectiveness away from some of the heavy hitters that Isengard still have at their disposal. They need to try and, well, they need to really make up their mind about what they're going to do here. I think all in is the only way. Dragon's Wrath crossbow is going to be committed to the front line. Certainly no slouches, but not the heavy hitters maybe that will be required to win out in the long run here. There, River Patrol just about able to handle their shots to avoid the corner of the building. Panzer forces evenly matched. It might still be the case when all of the other units arrive. The ballista crew's still there. Are they going to send a flanking force? I mean, yes, both of the high-quality Dorwinion units are going to go round to the other side, and I think that's fine, because they've got things under control here for the time being. I think the numbers and the quality are now in favour of the defenders. I don't really see how they lose from here. And if they didn't have those high-end units, I would suggest that things would be a lot closer, because, again, those Isengard heavy hitters are scary. Berserkers, what are they going to do? Head to the front line. Now that the quality is not going to be committed to the main front, the Berserkers can go over there and really cause a bit of a stir. I think the Medicel Guard are on their way back, mind you. The Ballista has also wheeled its way into position. Neither side really has anything in the way of range support anymore. Maybe the Ballista still has some bolts left in it, but it might be more trouble than it's worth, because I mean, if they just leave the engagement as is, let it come down to a case of pure infantry, the defenders should go on to win this. Whereas if a stray ballista bolt rips through the back of their own men and causes some of the weaker among them to rout, things might be called into question. Perhaps not worth the hassle. Medicel Guard on the way here, as well as the Westmark infantry. Played a good game, the defenders, even in spite of some RNG going against them, especially as it pertains to the Dwarven catapult, but overall I think the way they've situated themselves has been just what you need as a defender, keeping yourself structured, certainly not panicking. Westmark Marshals arriving, maybe a little bit ahead of schedule. Dorwinion quality not quite ready to reinforce this battered unit of Rohan and Axemen. The party started a bit early. Crossbowmen also over here, a little bit of support coming in, and certainly going after a unit which they will need to stop with some sort of range support. Caden needs to commit to this fight still though, because there's no way that the crossbows will be able to deal with them quickly enough. A clash of the titans here, although the Nazkai won't be particularly happy about facing down a far healthier unit of Morroquindi Glade Lords, especially given the level of defence that the Dorwinion warriors bring to the table. There's also the small matter of the other Dorwinion bodyguard also arriving, so no rest for the weary. The attackers find themselves surrounded. There is still an escape for any unit that wants to rout off into the open field over that way, but by the time I think many of these units consider doing that, that opportunity will be gone. Seems certain. I mean, again, this is Berserkers and Dragon's Wrath crossbows and Balked Sapphire Bladesmen, all units that are very capable in melee, so that's not terribly surprising, but again, all they need to do is hold on. The Medicel Guard's presence will only increase their ability to do that. Uruk-hai Reavers trying to defend the flank of the Nazkai as they fight toe-to-toe with the Glade Lords. And The Elven unit is the one being targeted by the bolts. Surely these Uruk-hai Reavers are not going to last long. I do like the look of the Elvelyn Hammer Guard as well. One of my favourite human units in the game from a stylistic standpoint. And there goes the Isengard General. And these basic Reavers and the Ballista crew, among the most likely to rout at the loss of their Orc captain, or Uruk-hai captain. Hammer Guard going to just go after the crossbows, which is, or are they? Again, maybe a little bit of indecision here from Caden. They will get away with it from here, I think. Uruk-hai Reavers even brushing up against them may cause these Uruk-hai to rout at this point. And the Isengard Ballista crew also loitering for a little longer in the battle. Yeah, there go the Reavers. And even with crossbow support, the Nazcai's numbers discrepancy was too great, and the Glade Master's exactly the kind of unit that can go up against them and win unit type to unit type. A little bit more finesse about them, not particularly overly reliant on their armour either, which are the kind of units that the Nazcai flourish against. And the Hammer Guard will finish off what remains of these runic crossbows up on the hill. They have managed to rack up a little bit of a kill count for themselves against some high quality units. To be fair, nothing left of the Westmark Marshals anymore. The Isengard Ballista crew, absolutely no match for Dorwinion's finest. Up the hill, Sapphire Bladesmen peeling off the main engagement to try and reinforce over here, because they are still winning, to be fair, the attackers. The damage the units over here are capable of chucking out is a bit of a concern. Again, in terms of numbers, I think they don't have enough. And the damage that they are sustaining in parts. Medicel Guard, only just arriving on the front line, to be fair. Sapphire Bladesman giving the Hammer Guard a little bit more of a worthy foe than feasting on the scraps of the crossbows. There's the Runic General, actually. The Loka Khan, who will probably fall under the weight of those hammers, you would imagine. Fair. 25 Blade Masters slowly cutting their way through the Ballista crew. It is close, in all fairness, by margin. I just don't think... I think the level, again, if they didn't have those bodyguard units, which is why I was so down on their chances earlier on, I completely missed them in the composition phase. The Medicel Guard fighting their way to the front line has made this more of an even affair over here, that the attackers are still winning, but will take them significantly longer to break through now. And if need be, they can always commit the Ballista crew, which is 77 fresh bodies, to hold the line. Some of the battered units of Isengard also fleeing the scene. As these from crossbowmen are firing. Haven't given up the attackers, which is good to see. They will fight on. Trying to close up a little bit more, maybe trying to rout the Sapphire Bladesmen, but unlikely to do so. Hello. Blade Masters actually pulling their way through the Ballista crew, who are ultimately, yes, an irrelevant unit. The Sapphire Bladesmen, on the other hand, are holding up the schedule that the defenders wish to play to.
Good tidings. The enemy general lies
Loss
dead.
of the Runic General. A sign of things to come, perhaps. Try and sort things out over here once and for all. Only 8 Medicel Guard remain. Shows how much damage they took earlier on. The Ballista managing to find an angle. Smart Marshals trying to create that angle for the defenders, who have actually taken a lot of losses over here. If they'd left it much longer, if they did it too long, things might have gotten a little bit sketchy. Things might still prove to get a little bit closer for comfort than the defenders would have liked, given the edge they had going into the late game, but it goes to show what a bit of high-end quality concentrated on the front line can do, because the attackers weren't a million miles away here. Unit of crossbows still there. I think they were picked off ultimately. The Blade Masters still, while they may be depleted, they are. Again, they were good against the Nazkai. They're pretty ideal against a unit like the Urukai Berserkers, especially when they've got the best of their human companions fighting alongside them. Albeit those Isengard two-handers will be pretty good against the Hammer Guard. Strider's Wrath Crossbow have definitely proven their worth as well. They were getting some good shots earlier on, and they've also proven their mettle in melee as well. But their time has almost come to an end. Still a bit of ammunition. Close one as well. Within 5%. Probably will stay to be within 4% come the end of the battle. The Dorwinion general, the Vintner Lord, has been killed by another Berserker. The fate of both defending generals today. And it goes to show that while they almost certainly die in every single battle they play in the Berserkers, they go down swinging against no matter their opponent. And they've definitely fought some Titans today. And that will be their last action, I think. Only 5 of them remain. Berserkers only 15. And the Dragon's Wrath crossbows are wavering, and as soon as they rout, that will be the end. The Berserkers, of course, cannot rout, but they will fight to the bitter end. Close margins, though. I mean, especially when you consider how units can rout and that sort of business. It would not have taken much at all for the attackers to have been victorious in this battle. But again, by proportion, this is yet another defender victory in the new patch, which have been far more commonplace than attacker victories. Another good performance from Rohan as well on the defence, without cavalry, so it goes to show it can be done. I mean, it does take away one of their main strengths, so it's probably not recommended in the vast majority of situations, but this battle does show that it can work. Dorwinion, far more by the numbers from what we expect from them, but then they are a faction which pretty much does the same sort of thing every single time, especially when it comes to a siege. You know, the interplay between their elven and human units, and like I said, from the attackers' point of view, they weren't that far off. You know, maybe if they got a little bit more fortunate with artillery hits, that's really the only thing that could have changed things around. Again, maybe being a little bit more conservative with their... Certainly Rhun being a little bit more conservative with some of their high damage archers earlier on, instead of sending them into the meat grinder against elves with superior terrain. That could have made a difference, but these are all small things ultimately. And I do think the defenders deserve a lot of credit, because, I mean, some luck did not go their way when it comes to artillery. They did manage to win the artillery duel, which was significant, and they probably would take that given the outcome of the battle overall. But they also did a huge amount of damage to their own men, which could have ended in disaster, because, like I say, the human elements of Dorwinion and most of the Rohirrim army are certainly not immune to routing, and that could have ended very, very poorly, because if that front line had fallen apart, the attackers would have seized the day, really, and surged forward to victory, you would suggest. But that's the nature of things with artillery as a whole, and ultimately the defenders still had the better end of that, because the attackers, while they did get some good hits with their Dragon's Breath, they weren't able to ratchet up the same sort of damage as the defenders, and the Isengard Ballista was ultimately dealt with before it was able to do anything, really. So yeah, ultimately I think the right outcome, but the attackers were rightly also very competitive in this battle. It was a good tense affair, really, and a 2v2 siege is not something we see very often, so it's nice. Let's see what did the damage for Rohan. 314 kills on some Westmark Marshals, but 28 on another unit, so it goes to show how different the outcome can be when it comes to these high damage units, which don't tend to last too long. The Helm Hammers as well, they were pretty significant in slowing down the progress of the Trolls. They didn't get a lot of damage, and that was because they were right in the heart of things in one of the more violent engagements that the battle had. So low amount of kills, but still important for what they were when they were committed. Medicel Garb were also fighting off against mostly pretty high-end units, so that's a decent return considering the level of opposition. 741 on the Dwarven Catapult, so as much as it got a lot of friendly fire, it also got a ton of kills on the opposition forces as well, but they were very dense engagements, so again, you roll the dice in that sort of situation, and you would have to say that it worked out for Rohan, even in spite of those hits on their own units. But like I say, if they routed their own forces, it could have gone very differently. So it was a big risk. The Eastmark archers as well, 298, that's a good return on a unit of very basic archers, especially when you consider that the better Helmingast got a significantly lower kill count. But again, the situation on the ground can mean that some units have an unimpeded shot into the enemy for their whole ammo supply, and sometimes they get forced off immediately. And the throwing projectiles as well, decent return. For them, of course, we can't see the kills of Dorwinion, Rhun or Isengard, but Rohan with the lion's share. But then the difference between him and Dorwinion will have been the 700 odd kills from that Dwarven catapult, which could easily have spelt the defender's doom as well. So it's one of those, isn't it? It's a battle of chance, and it very often is when you're talking about artillery. And given the investment that every player put into their artillery on this battle, it was always likely to be one of the deciding factors. And so it turned out to be, because even, like I said, the Dragon's Breath got some kills, but certainly wouldn't have been to the same level that the Rohirrim were able to do. Isengard, almost nothing. Dorwinion as well, to be fair, it wasn't exactly devastating, that it was a supporting factor, but nowhere near as impactful one way or the other as the Dwarven catapult of Rohan ultimately was. So yeah, big thank you to Master Blaster for sending this one in. Big thank you as well to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. This one, there is a replay that I'm going to do, that I haven't recorded yet, but probably will do before this on Coruscant, so that means back to back we're going to be having a somewhat Dorwinion theme to 2 battles in a row, but I think that one will be before this one, or it will be after, I don't know, one way round or the other. It doesn't really matter too much after all. I still have a bit of a backlog, but it's deciding which ones to do, because there are some maps which I want to show off with maybe a little bit more of a unified theme rather than a bit of a jumble, which some of the battles are. If push comes to shove, I will use those though, depending on how many replays get run. And of course the faction overview series, which I am actually running fairly far ahead of schedule at this point. I think I'm like 3 weeks in advance. I've managed to get through all of the Arnorian petty kingdoms at this point, which, by the time this one comes out, I think Cardalan's one will have just come out. So, we'll be getting, I think we're around the halfway point of those. By the time we get through to December or so, we should be done with those, and we can start looking at having a different type of video take those videos place, which probably will be top 10s. That's kind of what I'm looking at the moment, and then we'll do an end of year wrap up, which of course the subject of which is still kind of up in the air. But that's a long way off, and I'm starting to ramble again at the end of a replay, so I'll cut it short right there. In terms of replays coming through as well, steady stream, and hopefully that continues, because a lot of these have been pretty good, and long may that continue. So yeah, big thank you to Master Blaster once again, big thank you to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.